The rain hammered against the glass of the office in Plateau, Abidjan, turning the city outside into a blurred, gray smear. Inside, the air was still and held a sharp, sterile chill. Vanessa, Patrick, and Daniel sat in a row of heavy chairs, their backs rigid, their gazes fixed on the desk. Between them and the lawyer sat the mahogany expanse of the table, polished to a dark, mirror-like finish. The lawyer reached forward. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of warmth. He picked up a thick, cream-colored envelope, its edges heavy with the weight of the contents inside. He held a letter opener, the metal glinting under the harsh office lights. He slid the blade through the wax seal. A dry, tearing sound echoed through the room, louder than the storm against the windows. Samuel sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture quiet and unmoving. The lawyer smoothed out the document, his eyes scanning the lines of ink. He didn't look up. He cleared his throat once, a sound that cut through the anticipation like a warning. The three siblings shifted. Vanessa tightened her grip on her bag. Patrick leaned forward, his knuckles whitening against the wood. The time for waiting was over. The lawyer began to read, his voice maintaining a rhythmic, flat cadence that offered no comfort. He bypassed the preliminaries, skipping directly to the core of the document. Your father, Joseph Kouame, left assets valued at 38 billion CFA francs. The room seemed to expand, then contract, in the wake of the number. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. Patrick, who had been scrolling through his phone, let the device slide from his hand. It clattered onto the mahogany surface, ignored. Daniel lunged forward, his torso hovering over the table, his eyes wide and unblinking as if trying to physically absorb the figure from the air. Vanessa went perfectly still, her sharp intake of breath the only sound in the office. The mention of the billions acted like a key in a lock. The previous stiffness vanished, replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. They were no longer waiting for news. They were calculating, measuring, and hungry. The lawyer did not pause to let the weight of the fortune settle. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across their faces, noting the way their hands twitched and their posture crumbled into undisguised avarice. They were ready to claim what they believed was theirs, blinded by the scale of the legacy. The hunger in the room hit a wall. The lawyer did not smile, nor did he allow the siblings a moment to revel in the total sum. He flipped the page, his movements precise and mechanical. There is one complication. None of you is entitled to the inheritance yet. The air turned brittle. Daniel pulled back from the table as if burned. Vanessa shot a sharp, involuntary glance toward the end of the table. Her pulse throbbed visibly against the skin of her neck. A rapid, frantic rhythm. "Don't tell me he gave it to him," she said, her voice thin and edged with sudden terror. The lawyer turned his gaze toward Samuel, who remained perfectly still. He gave Samuel the absolute authority to decide if any of you will ever receive a single franc. The words hung in the air, stripping away the siblings' confidence. They had spent years dismissing Samuel, treating him as an outsider, a ghost in their father's house. Now, the entire empire rested on his judgment. Samuel looked up, his expression unreadable, meeting their wide, disbelieving eyes one by one. The silence that followed was no longer about the money. It was about the sudden, terrifying realization of their own vulnerability. Patrick did not wait for the room to settle. He shoved his chair back, the metal legs screeching against the polished floorboards like a blade on stone. He stood over the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the mahogany edge. "You are joking," he barked, his eyes darting from the lawyer to Samuel. He paced the small space behind his chair, his movements jagged and restless. He turned on Samuel, pointing a finger directly at his chest. The room felt smaller, the space between them filled with 20 years of suppressed animosity. Daniel remained frozen in his seat, his mouth slightly open, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Vanessa stood up slowly, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth her posture, but her gaze remained locked on the power dynamic shifting before her. Samuel did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply watched Patrick pace, his posture relaxed, his hands still folded on the table. He waited until the silence between Patrick's outbursts grew heavy enough to suffocate the air. Samuel looked up, meeting Patrick's burning stare. "That boy," he whispered, repeating the label they had used for him for 2 decades. The words carried a weight that brought the room to a sudden, absolute halt. The memory of the office faded, replaced by the rhythmic roar of diesel engines on a highway. 3 years earlier, the Empire was a living, breathing machine. Joseph Kouame stood on a loading dock, watching a single, battered truck pull away, its chassis groaning under the weight of goods. He had turned that one vehicle into a fleet that carved paths across borders, connecting cities with the relentless efficiency of his own will. He kept a framed photograph on his desk, a snapshot of his 4 children, but the image was a relic of a time that no longer existed. At home, the divide was sharp and jagged. The expansion of the business brought more capital but less conversation. Every new contract signed meant another night Joseph spent away, and every successful shipment across the border widened the distance between his children and his values. The house was a quiet vault. The siblings moved through the halls like strangers, their interactions limited to demands and cold silences. Joseph watched his empire grow, but in the evenings, he returned to a dinner table where the air felt thinner, colder, and increasingly hostile. The logistics of the world were easy to master, but the logistics of his own home had already begun to fail. The friction reached its peak at the dinner table. Plates clattered against the wood, and the siblings kept their conversations centered on topics that excluded Samuel completely. When Samuel reached for the water pitcher, Patrick shoved his arm away, sending the glass skidding across the surface. The liquid spilled, soaking the tablecloth. Samuel remained still, his head bowed, while the others continued eating as if nothing had occurred. The silence from the kitchen door broke. Joseph stepped into the light, his presence commanding an immediate halt to the movement in the room. He watched the spilled water drip onto the floor. He looked at Patrick, then at the others. "A family is not only created by blood," Joseph said, his voice low and firm. He walked to the head of the table and placed his hand on the back of Samuel's chair. "Sometimes, the person who chooses to stay is more family than the one who shares your name." He scanned each of them, his eyes lingering on the defiance in their expressions. The children did not answer. They looked down at their plates, the tension in the room thick and unyielding. Joseph remained standing, a silent sentinel for the one person who had not abandoned him. The silence in the house did not last. 3 years passed, and the empire that Joseph had built began to show cracks. Reports of missed payments and stalled shipments leaked from the logistics hubs, turning into rumors of total financial collapse. The siblings reacted instantly, not with concern for their father, but with an urgent focus on their own inheritance. Phones buzzed late into the night. Vanessa and Patrick began meeting in private. Their discussions centered entirely on the liquidation of assets and the protection of their personal bank accounts. The empire, once a source of pride, was now viewed by them as a sinking ship. They stopped asking about the company's health and started demanding audits of the properties. Every decline in the stock price became a topic of intense, cold calculation. They viewed the potential loss not as a tragedy for their father, but as a direct threat to their future. Outside the office, the whispers grew louder, but inside the family, the loyalty had already dissolved. They were no longer waiting for the end. They were preparing to scavenge the remains before the foundation had even fully crumbled. The office door hit the wall with a sharp crack. Daniel did not wait for an invitation. He strode toward the desk, his eyes locked on a stack of ledgers. Joseph sat in his chair, his breathing labored and shallow. But Daniel did not look at him. He dropped a folder of bank statements onto the mahogany, the sound echoing in the small room. "You are losing everything!" Daniel shouted, his voice vibrating with frustration. He pointed a finger at the figures, his focus entirely on the dwindling assets. Joseph tried to speak, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water, but Daniel cut him off. "The bank loans are coming due. If we do not liquidate the secondary fleet now, the interest will swallow the remaining equity." He paced the room, listing debts and property valuations as if reading a grocery list. He did not ask how Joseph felt. He did not notice the pale sweat on his father's forehead. To Daniel, The office was not a home or a place of healing. It was a failing investment. He demanded a signature on the transfer papers, his impatience overriding the silence. He turned to storm out, leaving the papers scattered across the desk, his mind already calculating the salvage value of the empire. Vanessa was no better than her brother, though her cruelty took a quieter form. At first, she simply arrived late. Then, she stopped coming altogether. The heavy oak door of the house, which once stood open for her, stayed locked. When Joseph called, her voice was thin, rehearsed, and distant. "I have a board meeting, Father," she would say, her tone devoid of any genuine concern. "Perhaps next week." The weeks became months. Her excuses grew as predictable as they were hollow, designed to end the conversation before any real emotional demand could be placed upon her. She no longer asked about his medication or his strength. She stopped acknowledging the physical toll of his illness entirely. Inside the house, the silence deepened. Samuel filled the void she left, moving through the rooms with quiet purpose. But the absence of the siblings left a cold, lingering presence in every hallway. Vanessa had chosen her distance, and with every missed visit, she solidified the divide. She was not protecting herself from the burden of illness. She was choosing to erase her father from her life until only the inheritance remained. Patrick arrived with a heavy briefcase and a practiced, urgent stride. He did not ask after his father's health. Instead, he pulled out a stack of transfer documents, thick and intimidating. He laid them out across the desk, smoothing the pages with a deliberate, firm hand. "The market is shifting," Patrick said, his voice layered with artificial concern. "If we do not move these properties into a protected trust, the creditors will seize everything within the month." He tapped the signature line, his eyes unblinking as they searched Joseph's face. "I am doing this to save your legacy, Father, to protect what you built." He slid a fountain pen across the mahogany surface, nudging it until it rested against Joseph's fingers. He spoke of risk and legal safeguards, weaving a narrative where betrayal was disguised as duty. He paced the small study, his shadow looming over the desk, waiting for the ink to hit the paper. He did not look at the medicine bottles on the side table or the exhaustion in Joseph's eyes. He only looked at the empty spaces where a signature would grant him control. The room felt small, pressurized by his presence. As he waited for his father to surrender the keys to the empire, Joseph did not reach for the pen. He looked at the documents, then up at his son. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it hit the room with the force of a hammer. Patrick froze. The rehearsed expression of concern on his face fractured instantly. He snatched the papers off the desk, his movements sharp and erratic. He shoved the chair back, the wood screeching against the floorboards. "You are making a mistake," Patrick snapped, his voice rising in volume. He stepped toward the desk, looming over his father, the mask of the dutiful son gone. He turned his gaze toward Samuel, who stood in the corner of the room. The hatred was raw, undisguised, and heavy. "He will never be your real son," Patrick spat. He did not wait for a response. He spun around and stormed toward the door. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by the violent slam of the front door. The house went silent. Joseph sat back in his chair, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The last thread of the family connection had snapped. There was nothing left to say. The heavy silence that followed the slamming door did not lift. It settled into the corners of the house, thick and inescapable. Samuel did not rush to fix the broken atmosphere. He simply moved into the space left behind. He gathered the scattered files Patrick had left on the desk, stacked them neatly, and placed them in a drawer. Outside, the world continued, but inside, the rhythm of the house shifted entirely to the needs of the man in the study. Samuel began to move with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He spent his mornings in the kitchen, the sound of a knife against a wooden board the only noise breaking the stillness. He prepared meals that were soft and easy to digest, bringing them to the desk on a tray. He monitored the medicine bottles, tracking the dosage with a pen and a notepad. At night, he moved to the chair beside the bed, listening for the uneven cadence of Joseph's breathing. He adjusted the blankets, smoothed the pillows, and wiped the sweat from his father's forehead. Every action was intentional, a steady pulse of devotion that replaced the erratic demands of the others. The house was no longer a place of business. It was a sanctuary of slow, painful, and necessary service. The fever broke in waves, leaving the bedsheets damp and the room smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. Joseph shifted, his movements stiff and pained. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered in the air, before gripping Samuel's wrist with surprising strength. The knuckles were white against the dark skin. Joseph looked up, his eyes clouded with the weight of everything his own children had taken from him. He tried to pull his hand back, a flash of pride overriding his weakness, but Samuel didn't let go. He leaned closer, the dim bedside lamp casting long shadows across the floor. "You didn't ask if I was your blood before you gave me a home," Samuel said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the labored breathing. He reached out with his free hand and pulled the heavy woolen blanket up, tucking it firmly around Joseph's shoulders. "So do not ask why I am here now." Joseph's grip loosened, his fingers relaxing against Samuel's arm. The tension in his face faded into a look of quiet acceptance. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, his breathing evened out into a deep, rhythmic calm. The house remained silent, but the distance between them had completely vanished. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. Joseph pushed open the heavy oak door, gesturing for Samuel to enter first. The lawyer waited behind a desk stacked with pristine ledgers. He did not look like a man presiding over a collapse. He looked like a man holding a detonator. Joseph sat, his back straight, and nodded toward the lawyer. The man reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a single, cream-colored file. He slid it across the mahogany surface. Samuel opened it. His eyes moved rapidly over the lines of text. These were not liquidation notices. They were audit reports from the last 3 years. Every account, every logistics hub, every border shipment remained untouched. The bankruptcy was a fiction, a complex ruse built to filter out the opportunists. Joseph watched Samuel's face as the truth settled in. The empire was not failing. It was thriving. The lawyer tapped the desk, his expression unreadable. "Your father restructured the entire operation under a private trust," he stated. "He wanted to see who would stand by him when the money was supposedly gone." Samuel looked at the numbers, then back at Joseph. The silence in the room was heavy with the weight of the test that had just concluded. Joseph pulled a fountain pen from his pocket and laid it beside the trust documents. He pushed the paper toward Samuel. The movement was slow, deliberate, and final. "When I am gone, you will hold the keys," Joseph said, his voice raspy but clear. He pointed to the signature line. "But there is a condition." Samuel looked up from the page. He waited. Joseph leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, his gaze locking onto Samuel. "Do not punish them," he commanded. "They have shown me who they are, but you must be better." Samuel stared at the ink. He thought of the empty nights and the cold responses he had endured for years. The power to dismantle their futures was now entirely his. He could strip them of everything, just as they had tried to do to his father. The lawyer remained motionless, eyes fixed on the desk. Samuel gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning pale. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of heavy breathing. He looked at the documents, then back at the man who had given him a home when he had nothing. He understood the test was not just about wealth, but about mercy. The hospital room was a cage of sterile light and rhythmic mechanical pulsing. Samuel sat in the plastic chair, his fingers locked with Joseph's. The air smelled of antiseptic and fading life. The machine monitor showed a steady, climbing line until it didn't. The beep flattened into a continuous, piercing tone that filled the small space. Samuel did not call for the nurses. He did not pull his hand away. He sat in the silence that followed, watching the chest that would never rise again. He stayed until the room grew cold. Days later, the scene shifted to the cemetery. The sky was gray, pressing down on the rows of polished stone. Vanessa, Patrick, and Daniel arrived in a line, moving with deliberate, measured steps. They stopped at the edge of the grave, positioning themselves so the cameras could capture their profiles. Patrick wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, though his gaze remained fixed on the lens. Daniel lowered his head, his shoulders shaking in a rhythmic, practiced motion. Vanessa stood between them, her hands clasped, her eyes scanning the crowd for the press. Samuel stood 10 feet back, hands at his sides, watching them work. He was the only one not looking at the cameras. The lawyer stood and walked to the wall, pressing a button on the remote. A flat panel screen mounted above the mahogany desk flickered into a harsh blue light. The siblings turned in their chairs as the image stabilized. Joseph Kouame appeared, his face captured weeks before the end. He sat in his study, the familiar books behind him, his eyes looking directly into the lens. The audio crackled, then filled the office, his voice deep and steady, echoing against the glass walls. "I did not hide my wealth to punish you," he said. The room went cold. Vanessa gripped the arms of her chair. Daniel leaned back, his jaw tightening. Patrick crossed his arms, his foot tapping rhythmically against the floor. Joseph paused, his gaze seeming to sweep across the room. "I hid it to see if you would love the man, or the money." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The siblings shifted, their eyes darting between the screen and the lawyer. The atmosphere shifted from anticipation to a sharp, palpable tension as the recording continued to play, demanding their undivided attention. The screen showed Joseph leaning forward. "Samuel, you are the only one who passed the test." The words struck the room like physical blows. Patrick froze, his foot tapping, stopping instantly. Vanessa's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she stared at the flickering image. Daniel looked down at the mahogany table, his face draining of color. Joseph's voice continued, steady and final. "Because of that, I give you the power to forgive them." The recording cut to black. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the rain outside against the glass. No one moved. No one spoke. The siblings sat rigid, their previous confidence stripped away, replaced by the naked realization of their failure. They avoided looking at the screen, and more importantly, they avoided looking at Samuel. The lawyer remained motionless in the corner, his gaze fixed on the siblings as they grappled with the verdict. The power dynamic of the room had inverted. The ones who thought they held everything now held nothing but their own shame. Samuel sat in the center of the tension, his posture unchanged, his eyes locked on the space where his father's image had just vanished. Samuel did not rush. He let the silence stretch until it became an unbearable weight for the three people seated across from him. He adjusted his position, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. Every eye in the office tracked his hand as he reached into his pocket. He produced a thick, sealed envelope, the edges crisp and unbent. He laid it flat on the mahogany table. Then, he slid it forward, inch by inch, until it rested in the center of the workspace, equidistant from them all. Patrick stared at the document, his throat moving as he swallowed. Vanessa kept her hands gripped tight beneath the table, her knuckles white. Daniel leaned back, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid bursts. Samuel ignored the papers entirely. He turned his head, his movements measured and calm, and locked his gaze onto Patrick. He did not look at the lawyer, nor at the bank records, nor at the screen. He kept his eyes fixed on his brother, searching for a trace of the person he had known 2 decades ago. The air in the room felt thin, drained of the greed that had defined it only minutes before. Samuel looked past the document. He did not care about the billions. He did not care about the fleet of trucks or the properties. He leaned forward, his voice low but reaching every corner of the office. "I do not want the fortune," he said. The words hit the mahogany surface like a stone in a pond. He kept his focus on Patrick, who remained frozen, unable to find a reply. "I just wanted to be your brother." The room shifted. The hunger that had filled the office was gone, replaced by a vacuum of regret. Vanessa lowered her head, her hands finally loosening their grip on the chair. Daniel stared at the floor, his face unmoving. Samuel stood up. He did not gather his belongings. He left the documents where they lay, a testament to a value they could not grasp. He walked toward the door, his steps measured and quiet. He did not look back. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. Behind him, the 3 siblings remained seated, trapped in the silence of their own choices. They were surrounded by wealth, Yet the room felt entirely empty. The final verdict had been delivered, not by the law, but by the absence of an answer.